So I'm very happy to see all of you and to know that you are seriously pursuing dialogue studies, because this is something very vital and important for the future of the planet and for all of us. And the uh, importance of dialogue is cannot be overstated, because we are living in a highly conflict prone era. That's the main point I want to start with. There is a lot of geopolitical contestation and rivalry and conflict, as well as violence happening around the world. And many of the features that were seen as 19th and 20th century phenomena, wars, large scale displacement, refugees, and suffering, all these have come back. And you see that with the ongoing armed conflicts, and also there is a higher degree of tension and competition and contestation. So that's the bigger challenge that we are facing, and this is something that every almost every region of the world is facing, and in some form or the other. So while, for example, there's a lot of focus on the Russia-Ukraine conflict in Europe in the media, there are several other armed conflicts that are happening. You may have been following what's happening in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. You may have been following what's happening in multiple parts of Africa, including Ethiopia, the Congo, and Somalia, to name a few. And you may also be watching with great concern the increasing tensions and rivalries in Asia, especially in the Indo-Pacific. So if you look at the global scenario, there are multiple flashpoints and some very active war zones right now. It's not looking like a very peaceful era that we are going in. So the first and foremost point is that we are living in actually an era of increased conflict and competition, and both interstate and intrastate violence. So that is where dialogue comes in, and that's where cooperation comes in. I'm going to talk about different forms of cooperation to try and overcome what we are witnessing. But first, let's understand why this is happening. I mean, this seeming disorder or seeming lack of any kind of stability or peace. Why are we going back, quote unquote, going backwards and repeating the follies of the earlier centuries? Why is 21st century not looking sorry, as rosy and progressive as it had been projected? And I can also add a few other elements apart from what I just mentioned, so that you get a broader sense of the depth of the problem. I mentioned the intrastate violence. Now, a lot of the conflicts are actually happening internally as well. And within nation states, there are so-called civil wars, so-called major divisions, and ethnic violence and such things. And these are, of course, a feature of the post-code. Since the 1990s, we have been seeing those. But now you see enhanced intensity even to those. And these are not necessarily all internal wars, because they are fueled and precipitated from outside. So these are complex conflicts which involve external players, and also domestically there is a tendency to go towards greater violent outcomes. So we are living in a much more tense and charged environment than was the case even say 10 years ago. So something has been happening in the world in a deep and fundamental way, which is taking us quote unquote backwards. So this is the problem. I wanted to start with the problem, so you can all reflect on the nature of this problem. And there are multiple causes for this. The publications I have shared, which I've written a few years ago, talk about great powers and great power uh, rivalries, and also great power actions. So the one way of looking at it is that the responsibility lies with the big countries, the most powerful countries, and what they're doing. That's one way of looking at it. Um, Today, most of us are of the view that there are only two great powers, China and the United States. Now, in many of these theaters I'm talking about, especially in Europe and Asia, these two great powers have a significant role to play. Then there are former great powers like Russia that are also flexing muscle and trying to re-establish their spheres of influence or empires in their former uh, Soviet spaces. And this is also one of the propelling factors. And some argue that it's not only the great powers, but also their allies. So in many parts of the world, they have an alliance system, and the allies, because they have backing and support from the great powers, can then use that as a license to settle scores in their neighborhoods or in their regions without having to worry about being pulled up at the international level. Um, so, and one of the indicators of this is the uh, usage of the veto power by the permanent members in the Security Council. If you see the data now, I'm going to share with you the UN official veto usage of veto power, and you can see how they have increased in intensity in the last few years. And you can see the countries that have exercised the veto powers. Okay. So just look at the chat box in which I'm going to be uh, sharing the link to this. Yeah, this is now you can see here. If you look at permanent member casting negative vote, okay, are you all able to open this link that I just sent? Are you able to open the link? Is it working?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So now if you click on that and look at the column on the right hand corner called permanent member casting negative vote, okay, and look at the agenda item. These are some of the major issues that have come up at the UN Security Council. And look at the last 10 years, especially since 2011, actually 2011 onwards, because the war in Syria started. The Syrian war was the first big war of the 21st century. And now we have many others like Ukraine and the Caucasus. So the first big war of the second decade of the 21st century, I mean, sorry, because there was the Iraq and Afghanistan also before that. So 2011 onwards, look at the list, and it's mostly China and Russia, but also the United States using the veto a number of times, especially on the Palestinian issue, but also interestingly on an issue relating to threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist attacks. But in general, you can see that the willingness of the major powers or the permanent members of the Security Council, especially Russia and China and the US, to use the veto has increased. The number of resolutions, and a lot of these have to do with war zones. You look at the agenda items. A number of these have to do with highly explosive situations that I talked about in Africa, in the Middle East or West Asia, in Europe, and in the Indo-Pacific and in the East Asia. There are even some on Latin America, like Venezuela. So um, the point I'm making is that there was an era when, and if you scroll down further and look at an earlier era, let's say prior to um, 2011, you find that the veto was not being used much. It was mainly the US that was using the veto power whenever there's a resolution against Israel. In the Security Council, the US used to use the veto. But on most other issues, you don't find vetoes. In fact, there's a long gap between 1995 and 2007 when Russia was not even using, or 2004 when Russia was not even using the veto. But now it's very common. And this is what is happening at the apex level in the Security Council. And I just wanted to highlight that to show why even the international organizations seem to be totally paralyzed and incapacitated. Um, and in fact, in this list, you can ask yourselves, how is it that, um, yeah, so there's only one resolution in September 2022 on peace and security in Ukraine that's vetoed by Russia. But otherwise, it looks like there is a mismatch between the issues that are being taken up here and the urgency of these crises on the ground. So you'd wonder why are they so divided and why are they not doing? It's because of this geopolitical rivalry, or the return of geopolitics that I'm talking about. It was less conflicted before 2011, but especially since the Arab Spring uprisings and the interventions and the wars, you find that there's more and more opposition and internal divisions among the Security Council members. And the Security Council itself remains unreformed and lacks adequate representation of the uh, recently risen or rising powers. So there's no Brazil, there's no India, there's no Indonesia, there's no South Africa, there's no Nigeria. So we have a problem here where the institutions are not responding to the urgent and pressing crises of our times and are not able to solve them. And on the ground, there's a lot of conflict happening. So that's the big picture that I'd like you to think about, because um, institutions like the UN, as well as regional organizations, like the African Union or the ASEAN, um, these are supposed to be, or say the Arab League. Now these are supposed to be um, at the vanguard of trying to maintain stability and internal cohesion and regional order in different parts of the world. But they are not necessarily, they are not in fact able to do justice to their mandates and are not able to keep the peace. And so it's not just the UN, but even regionally. Now, if you look at for example, the Myanmar situation, ASEAN has been really struggling with what to do with Myanmar. They have, since the military retook power and overthrew the hybrid regime and put Aung San Suu Kyi back in jail, um, they have clamped down very hard on the society using very repressive tactics. Um, and they've also restarted the wars against the ethnic minority groups. There are like multiple, those of you who know Myanmar, there are at least 6 or 7 armed secessionist groups. And the military is now using lethal firepower to try and control all of them. And all the peace agreements that had been signed during the hybrid regime have more or less collapsed. So, and then there is the what the UN calls genocide against the Rohingyas, who are mostly hiding for safety in Bangladesh. There are almost, I think, close to 1 million of them now. So all these things have happened, and yet ASEAN as a regional organization has not been able to come up with a solution to reining in the junta, the military junta in Myanmar. So the most they are doing is now, earlier they had total non-interference in internal affairs, that kind of principle. Now they are basically um, uh, preventing Myanmar, or kind of like ostracizing Myanmar and keeping it on the side. They're not allowing, they've announced that they will not allow Myanmar to take the rotational ASEAN presidency, which is coming up. They have prevented the Myanmar junta leaders from attending ASEAN summits and all that. And there is a kind of like a boycott Myanmar sentiment within ASEAN because of these problems under military rule. But nonetheless, that has not necessarily loosened the grip of the military dictatorship in Myanmar or the atrocities that are happening. So you have this kind of a classic case. The UN, you can already see that Russia, for example, when Myanmar is brought up, let me see, when was the last time we had a Myanmar resolution in the Security Council? I'm just trying to pull up. It's been a while. Students, can one of you just find out from the list when was the last Myanmar resolution? I'm just trying to look up. I think there was one on the 2007. 2007.
2007.
Yeah, that was the last time. So there is not even a resolution that's come up at the Security Council, because generally China supports the Myanmar junta. They support the military rule and the military, because when there is a democratic shift towards democratic future, then China's options are limited, and other powers like India and the Western countries have higher influence, and Japan have higher influence in Myanmar. So you can see that even though there is a big crisis, of course, parallel to the UN Security Council, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has taken up the Rohingya tragedy for war crimes and for crimes against humanity. So there is a separate thing happening. It's not listed here in the Security Council. But whatever the case, here is a big burning crisis, but it's hardly getting the attention it does. And even if it does, then it is at the risk of being vetoed. So what I just gave you this example. There are many others. Some of you may be following what happened in West Africa in the last few months. There's been one more coup in Niger. I think this is the fifth military coup in a row, if I'm not wrong, in the region in the last few years. Mali had one, Guinea had one, Burkina Faso had one, and Niger, and then I'm missing one more, maybe Central African Republic. So a number of these countries, you find military coup d'etats and highly repressive regimes coming in. And again, the regional organizations or the UN or any other international body has not been able to do much about it. In the case of Niger, the ECOWAS, the sub-regional body, which is linked to the African Union, ECOWAS, ECOWAS. ECOWAS actually warned the Niger junta to step down, or else they will intervene militarily and restore democratic rule. But that threat has come to pass, and so far it has not happened. There's no regional intervention by ECOWAS. So Niger continues to remain under a very shaky and unpredictable and violent military dictatorship. So there is a link between these conflicts and violence, and also the forms of rule that are emerging. You can see from the data that at least since 2006 or 7, mm, democracy per se as a kind of form of rule itself is regressing around the world. And this is, in a way, probably one of the causes for these increasing conflicts also. And it's parallel to the uh, just the disputes and the territorial, rivalries and geopolitics, because mm, when you have increasingly more and more regimes becoming undemocratic or under military rule, then you have higher chances of violence and human suffering. And this is just statistically this is just statistically true, because these regimes, they don't allow any space for people to express themselves in any form. So then there is likely to be either internal or externally supported internal revolt or rebellions, and so-called civil wars and such things. So um, we have now a big this whole complex, this problem I'm laying out is one where there are no easy solutions, because the keepers of the peace, so to say, are missing in the Security Council, or be it at the apex level, at the top of the international order, or even regionally. And um, there is and related to this is what we call power transition. We are in the era of power transition, and the theorists say that power transition is inherently violent and unstable. What do I mean by this? Um, the after 1991, after the end of the Cold War, there was supposed to be a unipolar order with the US as the sole superpower. Now that era is over. That era ended with the rise of China. And now some people argue that we are in a new bipolar era, meaning there are two power centers which are always at loggerheads and competing with each other. China US competition is the number one thing, especially in Asia, in the Indo Pacific. But there are, so that's why you have like a possibility of a war breaking out over Taiwan or the South China Sea, or in the Himalayas with India, and involving Bhutan and other neighboring countries. So there is high risk with this, in the so-called bipolar era, where there are very few lines of communication and dialogue between China and the US, and increasingly a kind of mutual disdain and distaste between the two sides. And there is sufficient power, economic and military, on both sides for them to um, battle for influence in third countries and fourth countries and whole regions. And this is becoming increasingly dubbed as a new Cold War. Unlike the original Cold War of 1947 to 1991, this one is still in the early stages, and there is still some degree of interdependence between China and the US economically. But slowly we are seeing the decoupling also happening. They're moving apart in terms of reordering and restructuring the supply chains and all those things. So it's not inconceivable that in next 5 to 10 years the competition will get worse, meaning more intense between these two countries, and conflict, because the economic linkages are being snapped one by one. Um, there will be more restrictions and more controls, and it looks like that decoupling may not be happening, decoupling as they call it, but they are using the term called de-risking Western countries to move away from China as much as possible. So this leaves a big question about um, where will they draw the lines, and could this lead to the similar kinds of destabilization and warfare and suffering as we saw in the first Cold War. Because during the original Cold War, the developing countries became the theater where the Soviets and the Americans were vying for influence and intervening in those countries. I don't have to mention if you see the origins of the current tragedy of Afghanistan, it all starts with the 1979 Soviet invasion, and then the retaliation by the US, and the kind of proxy wars. Proxy wars. In those days, they were called proxy wars. There were so many proxy wars. And now, in a way, those are likely to come back. And we could see those in different regions of the world, especially in Asia and Indo-Pacific. But how militarized they'll be remains to be seen. As of now, it's not as brazen as, the US supports the government and the rebels are being supported by China, or vice versa. China supports the government and the rebels are supported by the US. So far, it has not come out to that level, but you can see that there are factions within countries. Many of them, it will be like a pro-Western group of influential people, and factions in a country, and then there'll be a pro-Chinese or a pro-Russian. I mean, Russia, of course, is not a great power anymore, but in some parts of Africa and the Middle East, it still has influence due to historical reasons, and due to its past military interventions. So we have this scenario now where if you look at it, it's easy. I can go on and on about the problem, and none of us really have solutions. Especially if you look at it as a structural issue where there's a power transition and moving away from the US. And now if it's bipolar, and the prediction is in 10 years, at the current rates of differential growth, we're going to enter a multipolar era where there could be at least 2 or 3 more great powers. The candidates which are often spoken about are India, because it has very high, relatively high economic growth compared to all the major G20 economies, and potentially 1 or 2 more, possibly Brazil in Latin America, and possibly Indonesia, which is a big country in Southeast Asia. So among these emerging, and Nigeria and South Africa, of course, are big countries in Africa, but it's still too early for any of them to likely become a great power, meaning equaling China and the US. So you may have a tripolar world in 10 years' time, because in fact, I think 2027 or 2028, in just 3 to 4 years, the prediction is that India will become the 3rd largest economy. Right now, it's the 5th largest. And Germany is slowing down a lot. Japan remains relatively slow and still stuck in a stagnant economic condition. So the prediction is that in 3 to 4 years, India will leapfrog from 5th to 3rd largest economy. And that configuration, China, US, India, as the 3 biggest economies, and ultimately the 3 biggest militaries also, is likely to prevail at least for the first half of the 21st century. And there may be 1 or 2 more joining in this top 5 in terms of power. So you have a pretty good chance of what we call emerging multipolarity. Multipolarity meaning multiple power setters. And generally, according to the theory and according to the past historical experiences, power transition from one form to the other, from unipolar to bipolar, and now bipolar to multipolar, which is happening, they tend to be unstable, and they tend to involve a lot of conflict and potentially wars. Why? Because the ones who are the existing hegemons or the existing great powers do not want to let in anybody else to become their equals. So they will try to prevent the rise of peers or rivals from catching up with them. There is a likelihood of what they call preemptive wars, meaning wars that are waged by existing great powers to prevent rising powers from catching up with them. If not war, then campaigns of what are called containment. Now, the Chinese are saying that what the Americans are doing is to try and contain and stop our rise. And the Indians believe that the Chinese are out to stop and contain India from rising. So you can see a complex of heavy competition between the big powers. That's one way of looking at this problem as a issue of great powers and great power contestation and power transition. There's another way of looking at it, which is not to take the states, meaning countries, as the units of analysis, but to look at society and people and to use other forms of power concentration. So, for example, there is the view that, especially with the onset of the AI, artificial intelligence revolution, and the big tech. Have you heard this term, big tech? This has become a major phenomenon. These are not necessarily pawns of any country, although at present, most of the big tech, the leading companies are American, but the Chinese also have some very big companies in AI and in semiconductors and in quantum computing and all these things. They're investing billions into this. So some of these are presumably under state control, but some of these are also genuinely transnational, in the sense they're not necessarily. It's not like the US government is going to order something and that will immediately bring all the big American tech companies under their under their control. So there is an issue, especially with the Western big tech companies, because the kind of societies they come from are so-called free market capitalist societies, where they have a lot of power and influence, and where no elected official or executive or legislature can really control or limit their activities. So some are of the view. I mean, you look at scholars like Ian Bremmer. They are talking about. They call it a technopolar era. They say it's neither multipolar nor bipolar. Actually, it's a technopolar, meaning that large private corporations whose only motto is profit and maximizing money for themselves, they are actually becoming big powers, and they have more influence and control than even nation states over billions of people's lives. Yeah. So and the kind of data they are accumulating about users, about average people like us who have accounts and apps, is just unbelievable. So there is that dimension also, which people think that there's a lot of power concentration, and this is going to lead to a lot of what we call digital divide and inequality, and also possibly these technologies being used to create new forms of domination and exploitation. So it's not only the nation states, but also these big private firms, and it's not only tech. The article, my piece on the causes of mass suffering, if you read it, I also talk about the military industrial complexes. They are really gaining a lot because of these increased conflicts and tensions and wars. The SIPRI, you know what is SIPRI? Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. SIPRI, which is a well-known Swedish think tank, says that in 2022 global military expenditures were close to 2.3 or almost 2.4 trillion US dollars, and this is the highest. And they have shown year on year So this is adding up the defense budgets of all the countries of the world. It's not like individual countries. 2.3 trillion is the total military spending in 2022. Approximately, it may be more because many countries hide their real. I mean, especially authoritarian country. Nobody knows what is China's real defense budget. On paper, they only say it's like 250 or $300 billion, but the Western view is that it is at least double that. At least double, meaning maybe they're spending 600 or so. So anyway, the point is global military spending is rising, and in response to the insecurity and the wars and the conflicts that are raging all over. The idea is that every country needs to spend to equip itself better to face the threats, the national security threats that it is facing. So if you see from the point of view of the military industrial complex and the weapons manufacturers, this is the best time ever, at least since the Cold War ended. After 1991, defense budgets shrank, spending on military reduced worldwide, and these companies were laying off employees and cutting profits and bonuses. Now it's all come. I mean, just if you look at the Ukraine war since last year, February 2022, it's like a bonanza for the military industrial complexes. And interestingly, not only for big weapon suppliers like Russia and the US and China or the Europeans, but even smaller countries have made a lot of money making less expensive equipment which can be used in these wars. A country, a relatively lesser known player in the military industrial arena, like South Korea, has now become a top defense supplier with howitzer guns and tanks and all these things, and these are being used extensively in the ongoing wars, and also military buildups of various countries. So so big tech, and then there are these defense manufacturers. Arguably, they are also accumulating vast amounts of wealth and power. War is big business, and when wars increase in intensity and conflicts increase, it creates more opportunities for these, what some people call them as merchants of death. So that is that's another layer of powerful entities which seem to be profiting or even wanting more war, because that's the only way that their bottom lines and profits will rise. So the kind of contracts that are going now because of the conflicts for weapons manufacturing and delivery, just unbelievable, the scale of the business that's happening. So the military business has become a big business again after about more than 2 decades of lying low. Now they're booming, and of course people's lives are being lost in violent conflicts, but that's not their concern, because their main concern is to provide quote unquote security to whoever wants it or whoever wants to buy it. So there are major challenges there with these kind of actors, which are not necessarily always under the control of a single government or a state. And I'm laying these out because we need to understand where the conflicts are coming from and which way they're going. Unless we map out the main factors behind them and the main players, we won't be able to even think of solutions. Right? So let me now come to the cooperation part. So when the UN was created in 1945, it was supposed to end all future wars. And its main mandate was to, what does the preamble of the UN Charter say? To save future generations from the scourge of war, right? We, the peoples of the United Nations, having resolved to save future generations. So the idea was that by fostering cooperation, international cooperation, we'll be able to solve problems, we'll be able to build bridges, and we'll be able to um, increase the mutual understandings and reduce the fears and the old ways of thinking, which is based on competition and rivalry and nationalism and all these things, or ultra nationalism. So where did that go? Well, the UN did not, like I said before, from 1947 to 1991. During the original Cold War, also the UN was paralyzed, could not do much. Uh, it had a brief renaissance in the 1990s and the 2000s, when there were a lot of peacekeeping missions suddenly and more cooperation and cohesion in the Security Council. But then again, as you can see from the usage of the veto, since the Arab Spring and with all the military interventions and all these things, once again, there's total breakdown of unity and consensus in the UN. So cooperation, at least through the formal mechanisms like big multilateral organizations like the UN, is not happening. It's just not yielding any positive results. If you look at the record of the UN since the Ukraine war broke out, it is we can justifiably ask, where is the UN? It's not even visible on the picture, as insofar as peace efforts go. There was one small deal brokered by the Secretary General along with Turkey for the Black Sea grain supply to be enabled through by both the warring parties. But even that has broken down and it's not really working. As far as the ending the hostilities and starting negotiations and stopping the war goes, the UN is nowhere to be seen. It's not in the picture. So the idea that there should be an institution, an impartial or an international institution that can come in and act as a mediator or as a facilitator for peace talks and for dialogue, that is not working. That is not working. In fact, on the Ukraine issue, number of countries also, not just the UN, have tried and failed. Turkey itself has tried to be a mediator. It has not worked. The Vatican, under the Pope, have been claiming that they can try to mediate, but so far it's not worked. African countries came up with their own peace plan and with some kind of a offer for mediation between the two parties and their backers. It has not worked. And so even the Chinese, even though they are very much backing Russia in one form or the other and cooperating with Russia, they themselves have come up with some so-called peace plan of their own and have set up a peace representative to negotiate, to do shuttle diplomacy, and to bring about talks and dialogue. And that has also, I don't hear much about it. It was announced with a lot of fanfare about 7-8 months ago, I remember. Because after the Chinese brokered the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, suddenly there was this expectation that because they are more credible than the US in some regions of the world, meaning local countries are fed up with the Western intervention, so they may welcome a Chinese intervention. That didn't work because now that so-called peace initiative for Ukraine by the Chinese is nowhere to be seen. It's not yielded any outcome. So, so cooperation, at least in the form of mediation and facilitation for talks by powerful regional or global organizations or by individual countries, is not working. You do see some cooperation. For example, the G20 for example, which is more focused on economic issues and global economic governance, um, that is doing reasonably well. Just some weeks ago, I was at the G20 summit here in Delhi, and the success in terms of getting a consensus among 20 countries was quite extraordinary. In the current times, when the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans would not even see, and the Europeans would not even see each other eye to eye, to get all of them to sign on to a single sheet of paper with a commonly agreed wording on so many issues of global economic governance was an achievement which India did. But still, um, that doesn't mean the problems are going away. And even on economic governance, there's been a lot of focus on debt relief for developing countries. A lot of countries are on the verge of financial collapse, especially since the pandemic and the Ukraine war. So those are not going away. The G20 is making an effort through cooperation, through cooperative endeavors. There are a lot of issues with migration and refugees. I talked about this earlier. Again, you don't find many concrete examples of problem solving. The problems are mounting, but the solutions are hard to find. That's the reality. And the biggest factor, in a way, which is underlying a lot of these conflicts and which is new in recent times, is the climate crisis. There is increasingly correspondence or correlation between um, climate induced extreme weather events and mass displacement and armed conflicts. Um, if you look up the UN has a data on this. Um, uh, they are showing that um, 2021 UN High Commissioner for Refugees, uh, climate change is increasingly driving a lot of the forced displacement and wars. Sometimes people don't think about these um, as the main issues, because people think the conflicts are happening because of ethnic divisions, or because of politics, or because of great power rivalry, all the factors we already discussed. But there is, if you see, I'm going to share with you what the Office of the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights says. Um, Climate change is creating an intolerable tide of people displaced. So it may look like if you see uh, so-called ethnic conflicts, for example, in parts of Africa, they're not really wars between different tribal groups or ethnic groups. They're actually being fueled by the impacts of climate change. This is now proven. I'm going to share with you one of the recent analysis by the UN Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights. And what they're saying is that there is a direct link between most of the armed conflicts and climate. So, in other words, one, cooperation is missing, and two, the exacerbating factors that increase conflict and increase violence and increase human suffering are also not being addressed. So on paper, yes, there is a UN framework for climate change, and then there are these um, summits that keep happening, climate summits that the UN is organizing. I think the most recent one was it Copenhagen or Glasgow? I can't recall now. But the biggest one was in Paris in 2015, when the climate accord was signed by almost all countries. But whatever the commitments people have made are half-hearted, and many are probably not even living up to their commitments. So there is a fundamental crisis there, which is also fueling a lot of these conflicts and wars. There is a link between the two, and people don't often associate, if there is so-called unrest or disorder in Somalia, people don't realize that it's linked to conflict between cattle grazers and agriculturalists, and linked to shrinking natural habitat, and such issues. So I think in time to come, we are going to see more of a direct link between climate change and all these crises and problems we're talking about. If climate change is not the direct cause, it is definitely a kind of a catalyst that's making these worse. That much is guaranteed. So, if you ask me what are the major global problems, obviously the number one is a climate crisis, right? And it is linked in a way. It is a cross-cutting one because it's linked to the other global crises, the wars and the conflicts that we talked about so far, the migration and refugees, uh, shortages of food and fuel and fertilizer, and inflation. All these are ultimately, you can see a climate-induced um, factor in all these other problems. So um, there is this issue about cooperation even on the climate issue, and if this linkage between climate and the other problems is well established, then what it means is that if you solve the climate crisis or address it, it will lessen, if not end and resolve the other problems, including conflicts. Right? So we need dialogue at multiple levels. One is the direct dialogue I spoke about, between parties that are fighting and which are waging wars and which are engaged in violence. But then behind that, there's the other forms of cooperation we need and dialogue which we need on the climate crisis and the climate emergency. Now, the environmentalists generally are very disappointed with the slow progress being made and just the intensity of the extreme weather events. If you see what happened in Libya just a few weeks ago, in Darna, in the eastern part of Libya, on the Mediterranean coast, is just shocking. Just the scale of the flooding that you saw. That's just one of many examples. And it's linked to the climate crisis. And it's also linked to the ethnic divisions and the disastrous NATO intervention in 2011 in Libya, which led to the collapse of the Muammar Gaddafi regime, and created anarchy and chaos. So first they had dictatorship, and now they have anarchy. You choose whichever one you want. It's as bad as that. So this region where the flooding happened, the severe cyclonic storms are increasing due to climate change, due to extreme heating. It's a proven thing that warming and heat, excessive heat, generates more intense cyclonic storms and hurricanes. So that was, and then second factor was this region is controlled by a warlord called Khalifa Haftar, and this region has very bad governance, and there are no resources, and there's been massive siphoning of resources, like in most developing countries. But this is not even a regular developing country. It's a kind of a country that's been made to fail, a so-called failed state. So that kind of situation, how can you expect that dams are well maintained and serviced and are in good condition to fulfill their purpose? They were not. And so the dams gave way, and the whole city has been wiped out, and the official statistics are probably huge undercount. They're saying just, maybe 10,000 people have died, but it looks like it's a much bigger calamity than what is being made out. I wouldn't be surprised if at least 100,000 or more have died. just from flooding. And this is now going to intensify the conflict, because already there are so many factions, so-called warlords, and which have divided up the country into fiefdoms. And now there's going to be more of a internal dissent against Khalifa Haftar, and which may lead to more violent uh, engagements with their rival groups, with their rival so-called governments. Now they have like at least two governments there, and many smaller warlord factions. So what I'm trying to say is that the climate crisis is something that needs our attention. Even those who are into peace and conflict studies, traditionally we have never looked at this issue. We thought this is something to do with the environment. We thought this is, a scientific problem. We thought that this is something to do with, a different thing, and we are going to focus on political issues. But now you cannot separate the so-called political problems from the climate. That's become a major issue. So we need cooperation on these macro issues like climate. We need micro level cooperation, and we need facilitation, and we need also a new generation of thinking that depoliticizes issues. What I find is that there's more and more politicization of divisions. What There are two things. One is politicization, the other is securitization. Securitization simply means like creating more of a military dimension to any problem, or which will lead to use of force or threat of use of force. So how do we desecuritize and how do we depoliticize problems? In the case of since the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, for example, we have been saying that we should depoliticize food, we should depoliticize fertilizers, we should depoliticize fuel, we should depoliticize agriculture, essential commodities. We are saying this because a lot of the developing countries are dependent on these on imports of these commodities, and they were very hard hit when the pandemic and the Ukraine war happened in succession. And this has really hurt billions. I repeat, billions of people, not millions. So, and the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, for the first time in 30 years, they have actually some of the core goals like reducing poverty have actually gone the other way around since the crisis of the last 3, 4, 5 years. So absolute poverty has actually increased for the first time since the 1990s in the world. And this is happening as a result of these conflicts, as a result of the climate crisis, and as a result of the failing international institutions. So we need cooperation and to try and depoliticize these issues which are fundamental for humanity to just survive. And the question is, how do we depoliticize these? Through the G20 and such fora, we have been trying to depoliticize, but end of the day, the stakeholders do not necessarily see it as a matter of survival of humanity. They see most of these issues as instruments by which they can continue to wage war or compete with their rivals. So there's a term called weaponization. Everything is being weaponized, they say nowadays, in the current era of high conflict and tensions. Everything is being weaponized. Food is being weaponized. Water is being weaponized, meaning that denying it to your adversaries is seen as a way to succeed. or using it as a lever to try and pressurize your adversaries or your rivals. This is what is happening. Um, if you followed the crisis in the Caucasus over Nagorno-Karabakh, uh, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, these things have been used extensively. Even the war in Syria, um, denying access to basic humanitarian needs and supplies, has become a routine principle of the warring parties. So um, this is, I would say, the fundamental question with no easy solution. No, and my own view is that one of the reasons why we are not able to depoliticize or create a kind of countervailing coalition for peace and dialogue is because um, people have been disempowered a lot. People meaning ordinary people who just want to live in peace and to be left alone to carry on with their lives. They have been disempowered a lot in the process of the last 30 years in the post-Cold War period. Um, More of an emphasis has been placed on market values and market materialistic pursuits, and the what that has done is that, for example, you saw that after the Arab Spring and also after the 2008 economic crisis, the global economic crisis, when the Wall Street crash and all these things happened, there was an expectation that people will be able to get some take back control from these out of control big monopoly capitalists, and also big unresponsive and failed states which are not solving people's problems. There was an expectation that it will lead to some kind of maybe a revolutionary change in the power structure, global power structures, with more power coming into the hands of society and less into the hands of big corporates or the states. That has not really panned out, and to a great extent, people have just tried to survive without necessarily forming movements. Mm. Now, we know social movements historically have been very powerful instruments to bring change, and especially movements for dialogue and interfaith dialogue, for example, like the Hizmat movement of Fatullah Gulen, just to give one example, or the global compassion movement of the Dalai Lama. So there are such, you know, universalistic voices that have tried to empower people to think of better futures based on respecting the humanity in all of us. But then these don't necessarily become dominant strains. They remain marginalized and are not able to really sway the direction um, of issues. So what we are seeing is a kind of individualized, human society. At least that's the way I see it. With a lot of people thinking about themselves and how will I make ends meet, and how will I prosper, or how will I do better in the years to come, or in the days or months to come. Not about what's happening to my country or to my region or to the world. Not about um, what should we do about this. So from time to time, you see protests happening, especially in authoritarian regimes. You find protest movements happening against dictatorial regimes. Even China, one of the most controlled societies, they could not stop the protests from happening when they went too far with their zero COVID controls. The quite unprecedented scenes of mass protests across urban centers in China in 2022 that really rattled the regime, because they were not used to seeing anything like this, because they always used to keep a tight lid on dissent. But even they couldn't. So from time to time, you see in authoritarian countries, you see large scale protests that express the dissatisfaction with the status quo. You've seen those with the so-called anti-hijab protests in Iran also. They lasted for a number of months. Now it's been suppressed, and from time to time they keep re-emerging. Even in Russia, during the early months of the Ukraine so-called special military operation, um, there were widespread protests, especially in urban centers, against the war. But the activists were quickly bundled into jail, and most of the top opposition leaders, all of them are in jail now. So, um, and I can give many other examples of countries in Latin America also where there are no major wars, but there's a huge problem with organized crime and with drug cartels and syndicates that have completely taken over the whole countries and regions. Even there, you have seen series of mass protests and all these since the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is dissent, and people are dissatisfied with the way things are. But then they have been disempowered, like I said. These are not sustained protests, and certainly not systemically important protests that can bring about large-scale transformation. So, um, so what we need, in my view, are coalitions for peace and coalitions for justice across boundaries, across ethnic and national and other boundaries, and also coalitions that can uh, be like custodians for peace in different regions of the world. Right now, we're missing them because people are easily divided and disempowered. So, if you see, you know, uh, upheavals in different parts of the world, it's easy to mobilize people around narrower identities than for them to think that this is madness and why are we engaging in such mass violence and we need to stop this, right? So I think some value, even as a social scientist, when I look at the lack of solution, I'm myself wondering whether we should we should again relook at the spiritual movements for peace and dialogue much more seriously and revive them and make them bigger, because all the other traditional solutions, the ones I talked about, like international organizations and institutions and regional organizations, and none of them are working, right? So we need a different approach to this that is more decentralized, but one based on creating mass awareness and consciousness about the problems. Now, all of you who are doing this dialogue course probably will have much more awareness and consciousness than average persons, your own neighbors, wherever you live in the world. Right? They're not thinking about this big global or even regional issues. Right? They're just looking to survive in tough times and just to keep their head low and to live. That's all. I think we need at least to create higher level of awareness among people by bringing them around the idea that there are injustices and it's very unfair and things are not going the way they should be. Here are the problems, and we need to show moral power to and to come together um, to offer alternatives to the existing solutions which are not working. So it's different from mobilizing around, like, for example, class lines. I mean, the Marxists and all of them, they talk about we need you know proletariat, and we have to mobilize all the working classes against the injustice. I mean, that kind of thing doesn't work, because generally in many parts of the world there are cross-cutting socio-economic identities, and you cannot mobilize people on those lines. And I'm not even sure uh, the the communists themselves or the Marxists themselves have uh, confidence that they can do it. I mean, most parts of the world, uh, their methods, the traditional left has not yielded the outcomes and has not been able to meet the need of the hour. So you saw that especially after the 2008 economic crisis, a lot of countries with so-called socialist or left-wing governments that collapsed, and these regimes could not do much. So you need, um, I think, different form of mobilization and action by ordinary people around some common principles. Now, what is happening is there is, for example, a climate, like an environmental um, movement, which is strong, which is vocal, but then they don't focus on the other issues. So it's like a segmented. There is an anti-war movement in many parts of the world. There is a climate and environment movement. There's a human rights movement. There is, movement, spiritual groups and leaders and organizations that have their own movements. But usually they don't work across issues. They're all like identified for one thing. So there's this specialization or functional division that's happened. And I'm not sure that's helping the cause, because unless we show the linkages between all these problems, which we just talked about, and look at these as all interconnected, we won't be able to make much progress, because the individual issues, if you have a movement or a civil society coalition for each issue, okay, and then there are maybe 8 or 10 issues, big global issues or problems, then um, each is in a silo and not working with the other. I'm not sure that's going to lead to any solution. So I am for actually broader movements for peace and justice and dialogue, rather than movements that are all broken into functional specializations or issue areas, because that is not gaining traction. It remains like a echo chamber. All the environmentalists, they talk to each other and they mobilize among themselves. They are not working with necessarily with the human rights people or the peace communities, or the other forms of active citizens and citizenship. So I think there is some value to be had in a bottom up approach to global crises, because the top down approach from the UN and the World Trade Organization, all these are not working. And the middle out, as it's called, top down, bottom up, and then there's a middle out. The middle out approach is through regional organizations and through regional powers in different parts of the world taking responsibility. I do believe that regional powers and middle powers, emerging powers, have to play a bigger role. They need a bigger voice at the table also. Like in the G20. In the G20, all the major regional and middle powers are represented. But that in itself is not going to solve the problem, because they are rising and they are challenging the hierarchy and the existing status quo of the big powers. So that is not, in fact, likely to lessen the conflicts. This power transition that I spoke about earlier is actually likely to increase conflicts. So really, the bottom up is where we have a chance. But think about it. We are also a highly stratified global society today, meaning the level of inequalities are very high, very, very, very high. This is probably the most unequal era in human history. Um, Even in the times of feudalism or slavery, I don't think there was this much in previous ages. There was this much disparity as we see today. So that's what I mean by people are disempowered, because you can easily divide people on these lines, right? Saying this is not your group interest. Your group interest is in maintaining status quo, not to upset the status quo. It may be violent, it may be bad, it may be full of conflicts, but it's okay. We are making our money. So that kind of thinking has permeated to a great extent, and we need to break out of it and create, like I said, coalitions for peace and justice and dialogue, which are more broader and more universal. Let me just conclude by talking a little bit about nationalism, because that's linked to the whole era, this power transition also. Um, One view is that hyper nationalism and ultra nationalism are growing, and this also leads to more conflicts. And the other view is that um, when there are power transitions, naturally rising powers will assert themselves and will try to use nationalism to mobilize and rally people to their cause and to challenge the existing hegemonic powers. Um, yeah, so that's also something that needs to be channeled in a healthier direction. And that's why I said we need universalistic movements for peace and justice. Because what the nationalism can do is create some kind of deterrence and create security against threats faced by countries uh, from rival countries or from external forces. But what it cannot do is to resolve these um, cascading crises that I spoke about. So we need to um, think about this phenomenon. I mean, it's in a way it's unstoppable because rising powers will resort to nationalism because that's the main means for mobilization. But then the issue is not about that's a separate issue about creating a multipolar world order and all that. In the process, the question is, can we avoid wars? Um, we are not avoiding wars because wars are increasing in scale and intensity as we speak. But can we avoid world wars? Yes, looks like we can because the conditions are different from that of the 20th century. Um, so even this nationalism, if we are able to channel it in a direction where it provides leadership and recognition and status for rising powers, uh, which will turn them from dissatisfied to satisfied powers, or which will give them some kind of a respect and dignity, then perhaps we can avoid major wars and all these things. So I don't necessarily see nationalism as negative, but if it is used in a sense for territorial conquest or for domination of other countries or other regions or whole regions, then it will exacerbate the conflicts. If it is simply helping to make the international system more democratic with more powers, like I said, a multipolar order, then I think it's a good thing. So that also requires, we can't be too intellectual about this because um, channeling nationalism is not an easy task. I mean, it's like uh, you know you're like riding the tiger and nobody can get off, right? So um, nationalism is something that needs to be also rethought at the level of society. Meaning, is this something that we want, which will lead to more conflict with our neighbors or with our rival countries, or is this something that will simply help to channel our energies in a way that makes our country bigger and more important in the world? These are two different things. They need not be, again, it need not be weaponized. It need not be politicized. It can be a force for good. So, inevitably, in this era of higher geopolitical conflicts and contestation and rivalries, nationalism is coming more to the fore. But we need to be able to redirect it, I think, to try and control the worst sides of it. Because ultra nationalism or hyper patriotism or whatever you want to call it is a prelude to wars, and it creates history shows that it creates a certain dehumanization of the other, so much so that you're willing to go and kill because you've been trained so much to believe that the other side is not really human. So we need to check that kind of ultra nationalistic tendencies that we see in many parts of the world. It's not confined to any single country, and that also requires a great deal of understanding and dialogue, especially among young people. um, I think it's fair to say that the kind of planet we are going to leave to our successors is messier and worse than what it was when we got it from our ancestors. So we owe some responsibility to make sure it's not completely on the verge of collapse, and then we go, and then we leave the earth. I think there is a generational justice issue here as well, and this is where younger people may be more nationalistic, more assertive, but we need to make sure that it's in a positive frame rather than one which is meant to increase conflicts or to go to wars with your rival countries and all that. So so far we have avoided a world war, a third one, but this so-called new Cold War does not look very promising, and together with the climate crisis and other things, it's let me put it this way: there's very little to smile about or to feel satisfied about the way the world is today, and there's a lot to worry about, and that's why we need to bring about greater dialogue and cooperation between countries and within countries, the two different dimensions. And also we need to tame some of the excess concentration of power that may be happening. We need greater balance of power, both in terms of between countries and within countries. We need to check inequalities which are risen to all-time high historic proportions. I think these are the fundamentals. If we can fix these consciously or work towards these over the next 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years, by mid-century, if we can, if the planetary warming at least is controlled, and we are able to have some kind of stability with a multipolar order, I think that's a beginning for some kind of a better second half century of second half of the 21st century. So the first half, it's mostly been unraveling and crisis after crisis. So I think we need to have this little bit longer term perspective. Because right now, if we just look around, it looks like there's nothing to stop the wars and the conflicts and the climate disaster that's happening. But if you just take a longer view and say, okay, maybe this is a power transition, maybe this is nationalism, maybe they are all the inequality, maybe all these problems are compounding the issues. Maybe if we work towards a more equitable and fairer world, then the conditions for dialogue and for cooperation will also improve. Dialogue is in itself not I think a pathway or a solution. So it depends on certain underlying structural conditions. A more empowered society, more equitable order, and one where you have more conscious citizenry. I think without that, you can't. It's not like just a diplomatic mediation being done by some peace envoys nominated by the UN Secretary General or by big powers. That's not going to work. That sort of dialogue, elite type of dialogue, is not working, as we have already spoken. It's not ending any of the ongoing conflicts. So we need a kind of bottom-up approach to dialogue also, which is more holistic and based on understanding the linkage and the interconnected nature of things. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and happy to take questions and comments from all of you. Just feel free, please. Anything I've said or not said.
Thank you so much, sir. It was really enlightenment speech. Thank you so much. The thing is, since for more than 15 years in Afghanistan that we are hearing from our parents and grandparents about war, they are telling their stories to us, and it looks like that we are going to repeat their stories or our stories to our children. wouldn't it be the end, or when would we see the end of wars? It can be in Afghanistan, it's ethnic wars, it's civil wars, it's tribal conflicts, and so others. And there are also structures and principles of applying dialogue to prevent the proxy wars, or whatever we can say for that, to save the world, to save our economy, and whatever. If the dialogue is not successful to prevent these wars or such conflicts, so what would be the reason? Today, it's our second time that we're hearing about waging the war, and it's very bad, or weaponizing the countries for their profits. And as I believe, for Afghanistan, the UN do not want to bring peace in the countries. As I see in Afghanistan, the UN is not for ending the war, uh, but they are here for improving it. So, as we know, while the government handed over to the Taliban, the UN supported also the Taliban and the government. They supported both sides. They conflict each other. Finally, these days, the Taliban are on the power in Afghanistan. But the thing is, why the dialogue is not successful? Also, there are professors of dialogue, professors of international peace, professors of human rights or politics. Why these are not successful? Instead of decreasing the wars, every day we are a witness of increasing it against of that. Yesterday it was Afghanistan, Palestine, or Syria. Today it's Ukraine, and as it says, tomorrow it's going to be Taiwan or Iran or other countries. Why it's not ending, but it's increasing?
Thank you, Naeem. Good questions. I think we are looking at the wrong, solutions. Because, like I said, dialogue depends on certain underlying structural fundamentals. And my view is that unless there is a greater participation of people in these processes. Now, in your own country, you will remember, they had the Loya Jirga and all these things, right? Like large scale,
Yes.
gatherings of tribal chiefs and leaders and clan elders and all these things. Now, those are all good, but where are the women? Where are the the poor and the marginalized in these? Usually, these kinds of dialogue, even when they have been done, are done by warlords or powerful people who concentrate a lot of wealth and who got private armies and a lot of soldiers fighting for them. So that's a kind of, so the dialogue, that kind of dialogue is not based on broad-based participation, you see, and that leads to dissent and dissatisfaction. Wherever the dialogue processes have happened like this, where elite uh, political figures have been dominating the show, it's more like a power sharing. They call power sharing many parts of the world, and that kind of dialogue is simply to, okay, you get this ministry, I get this ministry, and your people will control these parts of the country. My people will control these parts of the country. So those sort of, it's more like bargaining, and jockeying for power and wealth. That's what happens in the name of dialogue. So what happens is, as a result of it, is that this does not bring in all the stakeholders, no. And right now we know in your country what's happening with girls' education and all this. This is terrible, and we all are highly concerned about this. The whole world is, but the point is, people are also exhausted from fighting, right? I mean, it's from 1979, is almost 40, more than 40 years the wars have been going on. So I
Yeah.
see that right now, the current phase, is not permanent, but it will last for some time because the whole society is exhausted from fighting and they need a break, even if it is under a dictatorship, a so-called fanatical or religious dictatorship. For a while this is going to last. The question is how we can strengthen the grassroots communities to be more involved and to be participative. Now, in the case of the Qatar negotiation, you remember when the so-called transition talks were happening.
Yes.
The government side, you would see maybe a few women going as delegates. Taliban side, there were no women at all, zero. And this is, and even the government side, I think it's more because the donors are the donor countries or somebody is pushing them to go for it, and they want more women's representation and equality and all. So there is this, I think one has to work at that level, and even when they say, for example, I know we have a Center for Afghanistan Studies here in our university, and my colleagues say that it is wrong to say that right now it's a Pashtun rule. Some people say the Pashtuns have won the war, civil war, and now they are ruling as Taliban, because Taliban also represent only some specific subsection of the Pashtuns, not all of them, and there are also marginalized Pashtuns, many marginalized Pashtuns. So I think we have to, and the same applies to many other countries. What is happening is the dialogue itself has been hijacked by elites, and they then use it as a means to acquire more power or more wealth. So we have to deconstruct the dialogue itself, and even the UN organizes many peace conferences, and where they say, what can we do? Those are the power structures in those countries. What can we do? Ideally, yes, we should have more participation of all kinds of marginalized people groups, but what can we do? We have to go with whatever is there in that country. We have to work with whoever is in power there. So I think there is this fundamental problem with the conflict resolution and dialogue, which are based on respecting the strong but neglecting the weak. We need one where, okay, the strong will be there. They will always be there at the table. You can't exclude them. I'm not asking you to us to exclude them. I'm talking about how to include more people, how to make it more inclusive. This is a big challenge. The powers that be, the status quo powers, do not want those who are outside the corridors of power to come in and to have a voice, because then they cannot control and they cannot maximize their own vested interests. So it's a long. So I think, especially with your country, Naeem, I feel like we are going to see some changes in 5 to 10 years. But for now, I think what we need is to have patience and to quietly work to mobilize the ordinary people around the idea of equality and peace and inclusivity and participation. Right now, it is not at all an inclusive or a participative regime, and if the world is saying that it should be more participative, more inclusive, but Taliban are not accepting any such external conditionalities. But there will be a time when the resentment will build up to this kind of rule. So I don't see this as permanent, but it also, I think, Afghan society, which is battered by war for so many decades, has also undergone a lot of shocks and deformities. So the armed conflict has created a lot of divisions and problems in the society. So I think we need patience. We need to have strategic patience and work towards a better future.
We hope so. Thank you, sir.
Okay, students, anyone else wants to come in? Any of the women students, please? Most welcome to raise any question you'd like.
Hello, sir. The lecture was quite good. I have a question. Will you please reflect on the between as you talked about that form of nationalism is very harmful and it should be changed. So, is nationalism important for the formation of a nation?
Vaishali, I couldn't hear your full questions. Your voice was breaking. So, what is your question again? Could you just repeat that?
Will you please reflect on the relationship between nationalism and nation? Is nationalism or the concept of nationalism important for the building of a nation?
Oh, yeah, sure. If you take a historical view, longer term view, nationalism was a liberating force against empires or against the control of like the Catholic Church and all that. Nationalism was if you see the political geography of the world, even let's say 100 years ago or 150 years ago, it was all empires, right? Like the whole world was divided into some 8 or 9 giant empires. So nationalism was a very, very significant force for decolonization, for us to get freedom from European colonial rule, and it was a liberating force. Nationalism was the basis on which the people of the global South could finally break the shackles of centuries of colonial domination and exploitation. So nationalism historically was important because today we have 193 or 94, 193 nation states in the UN, is it? Or 194, I can't remember now. And just at the creation of the UN, go back to 1945, less than 100 years ago, there were just like 50 signatories to the UN Charter at the founding. So without nationalism, we would not have been able to achieve this more, relatively speaking, a more democratic order than the era of empires. Um, some of these empires were so big and so transcontinental. They used to say that the sun never sets on the British Empire, meaning that they control so many parts of the world. If it is night in one part of the empire, it is day in another part of the empire. The empire is so big, you know, dozens of countries. Even now, I think the Commonwealth, which is a former British colonies, there are some 70 countries in the Commonwealth. You may want to check it up, or 60 or 70 countries still in the Commonwealth. These are all formerly part of the empire. So it's better to have nationalism than empires. That much is clear. Now the question where I was raising the point about nationalism is how do we prevent it from triggering more wars and so-called interstate war or so-called civil wars? Because in some parts of the world, the term nation and nationalism has also been very narrowly defined. It's not the full broader corresponding with the nation state vis-a-vis outside countries, but also internally among ethnic groups. So because the so-called radical Hutu in Rwanda thought that they were a nation and different from the Tutsi, they could carry out genocide. So there is this narrower or more, let's say, intolerant type of nationalism that can be quite harmful and can increase these ethnic divisions or interstate wars and all these things. So I think it's a force for good, but it needs to be harnessed in the right direction. Like I said, if nationalism helps a society to be more disciplined, to work harder, and to become more powerful in the world through economic and through productive activities, I think it's a good thing. But if nationalism is basically used to spend more on the military and to try and dominate other countries, the problem we are seeing with China now is that because they are using hyper nationalism to try and justify their revision of the existing order. They're basically saying that the sentiments of the Chinese people are being hurt by others, and so we have a right to retaliate against others. So they are using that idea of nationalism as a way to glorify China and to establish their superiority over other countries, which is leading to a backlash and is likely to lead to wars in this region, in the Indo-Pacific. So I think nationalism is something that, in a controlled and in a restrained way, I think it's a very desirable thing, but it needs to be channeled, and it needs to be more broad-based, not very narrow, and certainly not. I mean, some people say that I prefer to be a patriot rather than a nationalist, and they make the distinction. They argue that patriotism is morally superior to nationalism. I'm not going to get into all those semantics. I'll simply say that we need to regulate it better, and we need to limit the competition and conflicts based on nationalism. Okay. Any other questions or comments, please? Are we all good? Okay, great. Well,
sir, I had a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
So, sir, first of all, thank you for addressing us today. So, you talked about the period of violence and uncertainty that we are living in today, and then turning to broad global civil society based movements. So, sir, would you say that we have again fallen into a debate of realism versus idealism? And given that we knew the outcome the first time around, would you say the same patterns would repeat and we would again fall in a wheel like situation where there is no solution, real solutions being offered?
Well, I don't know if there is a circular motion here, meaning we will go back to a more stable and a less conflict-prone era. But like I said, the theory suggests that once a new order is formed and accepted by everyone, then it will settle down, and there will be lesser tensions and conflicts and wars. So if this multipolar era comes to fruition, maybe in the next 10 years, as I said, because of the differential rates of growth, maybe we'll see some kind of stability. And that's that could potentially calm down some of these tensions and rivalries that we are seeing today. Now it is more fluid, it's not a settled order. That's why it's called transition, power transition. It's still in a transition. And generally, power transitions takes several decades. So we are probably in the early stages of a transition to a multipolar era. So yeah, I think it'll take time. But what we need to avoid in the meantime is these things going out of hand and becoming bigger and bigger. Crises which are now confined to some parts of the world could become universal, and wars could spread, and the willingness to talk and to engage with the adversaries, which has become very low, could just vanish. So that's why I said people have to be involved in a big way. And this goes beyond realism or idealism, because none of them really talk about or liberalism, because none of them talk about getting society involved in solving global problems. It's more, I think we have to look at, that's why I said we have to look at Gandhi, or we have to look at Martin Luther King, or we have to look at our spiritual leaders and these kinds of people who probably have a deeper philosophical approach to these things. Because otherwise, we are not seeing, like I said, with the more materialistic actors, materialistic forces, they are not really able to resolve. And even the dialogues they conduct, like we just spoke, seem to be fig leaf behind which they are carrying on with their agendas to maximize their own power and wealth. So Um, yeah, I mean, rising powers, most of us coming from rising powers, in emerging powers, have expectation that the future is going to be better than the present. Because once the new order is settled, it'll look better. It'll be more stable. But before we reach that point, there are a lot of risks, and you cannot rule out even major wars, if not world wars. So, I mean, if the Chinese invade Taiwan, I mean, the Americans are openly saying it's going to be different. It will not going to be like Ukraine. Meaning what? Meaning that there is a likelihood of direct great power war, or if not war, then at least clashes and confrontation and threats of use of force. So those are the kinds of things, the risks, the high risks that we have to navigate before we can reach a more stable order in the coming decade or two. Okay, folks, anything else you'd like to raise before we close? I host my own TV show on India's national television channel, and I hope you get a chance to view it. Let me share with you the link to the playlist of my show, so that when you get a chance, you can also watch some of the episodes. Not all of them are focused on dialogue issues, but they're generally about diplomacy and foreign policy, which are, of course, more general. But they can help you understand the way the world is from an Indian point of view. So I'm going to share with you the link to my show here, so you can watch it. It comes every Saturday at 8:30 p.m. Indian time on DD India. It's in English. So this is the playlist. I've just shared with you the link to the playlist of the show. All the previous episodes you can watch here. We have done about more than almost 70 episodes now. So this is something I do apart from doing university work. So it may help you also understand things better, because given that you're all committed to dialogue and cooperation, it's important for you to understand also the current trends and the main fault lines and the problems in the world. So, in fact, as you may have noticed, even in my lecture, I spent nearly an hour only on the problems first. So, my show, we usually take up major issues and problems, and also the new developments in international affairs. So, do watch it and share it among your friends. Okay, folks, I'm so happy to engage with all of you, and all the best with your careers and with your studies and whatever you're doing these days. And let's be in touch. You can email me if you have an interest in what I'm doing, and I'm happy to respond. I'm just going to share with you my email address as well. And yeah, let's collectively think about ways and means in which we can make the world a better place. This is not going to be decided by elites, as I said. We need all of you to be involved as change makers and as thought leaders. Thank you so much. Thank you. All the best, and let's be in touch.